the Pontifical Catholic University of Porto Alegre. Today, we are very grateful to have Professor Lisa Diedrich giving her talk, relating also to her book that has just come out, and it was indicated on the advertisement for this talk. Lisa Diedrich received her PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Emory University in 2001. Since then, she has taught in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Stony Brook. Lisa's research and teaching interests include critical medical studies, disability studies, feminist science studies, and interdisciplinary feminist and queer theories and methodologies. Professor Diedrich is the author of Indirect Action, Schizophrenia, Epilepsy, AIDS, and the Course of Health Activism. That's the book that's been launched here at this event. And Treatments, Language, Politics, and Culture of Illness. She's also editor of the collection Feminist Time Against Nation Time, Gender, Politics, and the Nation State in an Age of Permanent War, in a special issue of Feminist Theory, Experience, Echo, Event, Theorizing Feminist Histories, Historicizing Feminist Theory. Professor Diedrich is affiliated faculty in the Department of Philosophy and with the PhD concentration in Disability Studies in the School of Health, Technology, and Management. Lisa, thank you very much for your kind acceptance of our invitation, and please feel free to proceed as you will.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And let me go ahead and share. Let's get the PowerPoint up, see if that's working. How are you seeing it, everyone? Good, okay. So thank you to Professor de Oliveira for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and I'm thrilled to join you as part of the Conjunctures series. And I'm actually really excited that of the possibilities of making connections between our institutions and departments. So I hope this will kind of promote those connections and collaborations. And I really appreciate Nita's work in cultivating these ties. And I really think that these kinds of collaborations are important, especially in these sort of illiberal times that we're living in. So I think more of this is important. I saw Camilla just come in, so I don't know Camilla, but she translated this, and I'm so grateful for that work, translating this talk into Portuguese. So thank you for that. The work of translation is so important, and I'm very grateful for your labor. So, and this talk is called Drawing Health Activism, Illness, Politics, and Practices of Care in Graphic AIDS Narratives. So let me just get started. I'm interested in the conjunction illness, thought, activism in time. Or put another way, I'm concerned with illness and disability in action in particular times and places. My recent book, Indirect Action, explores this conjunction in the period just before and after the emergence of HIV/AIDS in the United States. My intervention is theoretical and methodological, as well as political and therapeutic. By expanding the historiographical parameters through which illness and health activism in the United States have tended to be thought, I demonstrate how and why illness figured prominently in the social, political, theoretical, and institutional transformations that took place in the period from around 1960 to when AIDS arrived. Or in more graphic terms, because I'm going to be talking about graphic narratives, we might say that I kind of pop the frame of the origin story of HIV/AIDS. I trace the multiple figurations of illness and illness politics in some key texts of social and critical theory, many of which were later categorized as part of an emergent post-structuralism as well as in literary, film, medical, and activist text, many of which are formally innovative and experimental, in order to consider questions about, in the most general terms, being, doing, and becoming in relation to illness, experiences, and events, therapeutic thought and practices, and clinical and caring institutions and spaces. So my work begins with a simple realization. We cannot apprehend an experience, an event of illness through discrete disciplines and categories. This poses a problem of form and method as much as of content and concepts. My methodological solution, or maybe we could call it a methodological workaround to this problem, is to approach illness indirectly as a multiplicity of bodies and minds, concepts and histories, and clinical, critical, and narrative discourses and practices. In attempting to grasp what illness is in different places and times, I look for and deploy various method images, my term for verbal and visual statements that help articulate through condensation the complexity of an object. And this is one reason I am so drawn to graphic medicine as a form. How do we condense into an image the complexity of illness as phenomenological experience and epidemiological event, as localized virus and global crisis, and as much more in between? My work attempts to account for the often indirect and unstraightforward relationships between very big things, environments, economies, histories, structures, ideologies, and very small things, genes, cells, viruses, conversations, gestures, feelings, and between very fast things, a flash, an instant, a glimpse, a glance, and very slow things, the interminable, the evolutionary, the persisting, the gradual, the enduring. What emerges formally in my work is a kind of graphic analysis in which multiple and contradictory sites of illness, thought, and activism are assembled and juxtaposed. In recent years, comics and graphic narratives have become a popular and innovative form for telling stories in a medium that artfully combines words and images. One exciting subfield of the form is graphic medicine, which explores the conjuncture between comics, healthcare, and experiences of illness, trauma, and disability. The phrase graphic medicine was first coined by general practitioner and comics artist Ian Williams in 2007 as a handy term to denote the role comics can play in the study and delivery of healthcare. For Williams, the term suggests that comics can deliver a kind of medicine with salubrious, if not necessarily curative, effects. Increasingly, comics and graphic narratives have become important resources for communicating a range of ethical and clinical issues related to the experience of illness, and this hybrid verbal visual form helps healthcare practitioners, patients, families, and caregivers creatively reimagine the boundaries of health, illness, life, and death. Maybe I'm behind on my slides. There's graphic medicine. Okay, and then here we go. In this presentation, I explore this multimodal form as a means for articulating the illness, politics, and practices of care that emerged out of the response to AIDS as represented in a selection of hybrid verbal and visual narratives from the 1980s to the present, including Cindy Patton and Janice Kelly's Making It, A Woman's Guide to Sex in the Age of AIDS from 1987, Alison Bechdel's comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, which ran from 1983 to 2008, Jaime Cortez's online comic Sexile from 2004, and M.K. Serwick's graphic memoir Taking Turns, Stories from HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371. Patton and Kelly's Guide to Safer Sex for Women incorporated comics drawn by Bechdel in the style and tone of her comic strip, Dykes to Watch Out For. And Bechdel's strip, which began its long syndicated run in 1983, dealt with safer sex and AIDS activism and other forms of health activism on several occasions. Sexile is an HIV prevention publication created for the AIDS Project Los Angeles and Gay Men's Health Crisis of New York, and features the story of and interviews with Adela Vasquez, a Cuban transgender person and AIDS activist who came to the US as part of the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Taking Turns draws on Serwick's own experience as a nurse working in an AIDS unit in Chicago, as well as on her interviews with other practitioners and patients on the unit. All these graphic narratives document the intimate relationship between sexual politics and illness politics. And through formal experimentation and mixed methods, the text gives shape to particular experiences and events of AIDS in history, and more generally, to the conjunction illness, thought, activism in time. I argue that these eclectic graphic AIDS narratives depict a multiplicity of practices of care, art, and politics. They show how graphic narratives are a capacious, multimodal form that can make visible certain experiences that might otherwise remain on the margins, and they act as a kind of antidote to stigmatizing images of sexuality and illness. So first, sex, health, and community, and we're going to talk about making it. In 1987, Firebrand Books, a small feminist press, published Making It, a 30-page safer sex resource printed back-to-back with a Spanish translation. Along with Bechdel's illustrations, the text includes first-person testimony from women interviewed about sex, drugs, support groups, and activism. The guide provides advice that is pragmatic and non-judgmental. Even 30 years later, the tone and recommendations hold up as smart in relation to sexual politics, public health, and community organizing. And although the singular woman of the subtitle is a product of its time, the non-identitarian practice-based approach to sex and sexual health would prove medically and politically prescient. What is apparent from the people and institutions involved in this collaboration is the importance of lesbian, feminist, and anti-racist activism in creating the conditions of possibility for AIDS activism. At the time of its publication, Patton had already made the argument that safer sex activism was continuous, not discontinuous, with earlier forms of gay liberation politics. And indeed, Making It demonstrates how feminist health activism and alternative publishing projects born out of earlier liberation movements created a foundation for AIDS activism and a network of politically savvy AIDS activists and queer cultural workers. Bechdel's brief biography included in Making It touts her as an obsessive observer of the women's community, capturing well Bechdel's work in the 1980s. When I asked her by email how she came to work on this particular project, and also about the relationship between her work on Making It and her Dykes to Watch Out For strip, she noted that she had been drawing Dykes to Watch Out For years before Making It, publishing her first cartoons in the feminist monthly Woman News in 1983. That's where Nancy Bariano, who was in the process of founding Firebrand Books, first saw them, Bechdel wrote. She invited me to do a collection of Dykes to Watch Out for Firebrand, and that was published in the fall of 1986. Making It was a commission that also came from Bariano. Bechdel admitted that she was a little reluctant about the project because, as she joked, drawing heterosexuals seemed a bit of a stretch for me at the time. She recalls that Bariano encouraged her to do the project, even sending her condoms in the mail so she could figure out how to draw them, having never seen one in her life, she says. So there's her drawing of a condom. Making Condoms Fun is one of the sections in the pamphlet, and it encourages verbal and visual, we might even say graphic play, as part of sex. If you like to talk dirty, add the condom to your verbal games. Find images that make the condom part of sex instead of an interruption, the text instructs. Bechdel's drawings of a woman blowing up a condom like a balloon while her male partner waits with an impatient and unamused look on his face, and of a woman on her own practicing putting a condom on a very large vegetable in her lap, humorously puncture some of the earnestness surrounding not only safer sex, but also sex in general. The concept and practice of making it, then, isn't just about having more sex, but about making it better and more fun through safer sex play and creativity. Another key lesson of making it is that safer sex is not about identity categories, but about practices. Emerging first in LGBTQ community-based safer sex initiatives like Making It, this distinction between sexual identity and practice would eventually influence the nascent projects of queer theory and politics, as well as mainstream epidemiological and public health studies into how HIV is spread and the best interventions to prevent its spread. The section Sex for Lesbians and Bisexuals begins with the fact that many lesbians have the misconception that AIDS is not their problem, but immediately and emphatically challenges this misconception by explaining that risk comes from what you do, not how you label yourself. A cartoon accompanying this section clarifies with humor the point about the important difference between sexual identities and practices. Bechdel draws two women in conversation, one with an insouciant look on her face who says, "So what if I sleep with a man now and then? I still identify myself as a lesbian." Her companion responds pointedly, "I don't care if you identify yourself as an anti-nuclear macrobiotic foot fetishist. It's who you have sex with that counts." Making It makes clear that lesbians can and do have sex with men, and men who don't identify as gay or bisexual can and do have sex with both men and women. The pamphlet also makes clear that people aren't always entirely truthful about their sexual lives, and thus encourages learning to feel good about safer sex with the support of friends and through participation in rap groups, a continuation of the feminist practice of consciousness raising. So here's the rap group page. One rap group activity that Patton and Kelly recommend is the ranking exercise, in which cards are handed out with examples of a variety of explicit sexual practices, and the participants are asked to organize the activities in order from most safe to most dangerous in terms of HIV transmission. The authors explain that this sounds easier than it is in practice, and importantly, they also note that uncertainty often leads to frank discussions about what is safe and what isn't, and how best to practice safer sex. The exercise creates a framework in which people can learn to talk about risk, which then prepares and informs them in how to communicate about and practice safer sex with their partners. Bechdel's cartoon of a rap group doing the ranking exercise is illustrative of both the sort of frank talk about sex that emerges out of such activities and the surprising things we can learn from others and about ourselves. It also shows, again, why the multimodal approach to safer sex instruction works well. Bechdel's cartoon of the rap group works on multiple levels. We see that the group is fairly diverse in terms of physical appearance, race, and age. While the diverse representation may allow us to see ourselves represented in the cartoon, the image also encourages an identification with the rap group itself, that is, with the process of learning and teaching together as a practice of freedom. That Making It was published as a cheap pamphlet and with comics and humor to draw readers into a serious discussion of safer sex increases the likelihood of wider circulation and readership of important public health information. Okay, now I'm going to shift to Bechdel's strip, Dykes to Watch Out For, and this section is called Cartoons as Antidote. In her cartoonist introduction to the essential dykes to watch out for, Alison Bechdel tells us that she arrived in New York City in 1981, having just finished college and recently come out. We flash back to the scene at the moment of Alison's queer arrival. Olivia Newton-John's Physical is the soundtrack welcoming Alison to the city, and more specifically to the Duchess, a lesbian bar in the Village. We first see Alison outside the Duchess looking startled, as if she can't quite comprehend what she's apprehending. And apprehension here meaning both graspable and anxiety-provoking. The arrival scene is redolent with desire and a sense of possibility, both sexual and political, although as Bechdel shows, the political possibilities are not immediately apparent to the young Alison. The top tier of the following page includes 3 small panels, beginning with one showing Alison walking through the door of the Duchess, still looking apprehensive. This is followed by a close-up of the narrator cartoonist Alison in the present, in her archive, who describes her initial impression of the historical moment of her arrival in New York City by presenting a historical genealogy of queer New York. The underground scene of the 50s, the revolutionary ferment of the 60s, the radical gay and lesbian counterculture of the 70s, it was all over by the time I showed up. The next panel returns to the scene at the Duchess in 1981 and shows an awkward Alison spilling her drink as a dancing woman backs into her while the music plays, seemingly confirming the impression that Alison has arrived too late for liberation politics. The middle of the page contains a single horizontal panel of a stoned Alison drawing in her sketchbook and sharing a bong with her girlfriend and her girlfriend's father. A caption between the top and middle tiers states, "I was adrift that summer, aimless, lost at 6s and 7s, in short, bewildered." The newly elected Ronald Reagan appears twice in this panel. First, his name is in a headline in the newspaper Alison's girlfriend is reading, and second, as the unnamed and rather innocuous sounding referent in a caption at the bottom right of the panel that reads, "But some absurd old actor seemed to be running the country." The bottom tier of 2 panels punctures this feeling of aimlessness with a haunting reminder of another queer arrival to New York City in 1981, the AIDS virus. The first panel covers 2/3 of the bottom of the page and is the only panel in the entire 2-page spread that does not contain an image of Alison, either as cartoonists introducing the collection of Dykes to Watch Out For strips or as Alison becoming cartoonist. The panel includes an image of the New York Times from Friday, July 3rd, 1981, folded open to page A20. Most prominently featured on the page is the headline, "Sing Out on the 4th," with the music and lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner below the headline. Next to this advertisement is the now infamous first article ever published in the New York Times about the illness that would later come to be known as AIDS. Bechdel redraws the article's headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." And so this is the page that Bechdel has redrawn. I knew that this article had been published in the summer of 1981. I was also aware that the first story was deep inside the paper, not on the front page, and many people had already died. So this is a point of contention, of course, in the LGBTQ community. And that it was primarily concerned with reassuring non-homosexuals that there appeared to be no danger to them of contagion. Yet until I saw this panel, I hadn't put the article's publication together with Independence Day. And although I've read the article many times, I'd never seen the full page layout and its juxtaposition with the Star-Spangled Banner, music and lyrics as part of an advertisement for Independence Bank. So this is a close-up of Bechdel's redrawing of it. Bechdel's redrawing of the page captures the strange juxtaposition and makes us look anew at the placement of the article in the newspaper and gives us an eerie sense of how this moment might have felt for some readers, but not for others. Her one addition, the words "with spirit" under the Star-Spangled Banner heading and in the same cursive script, works as a dig at the thoughtlessness, even heartlessness of the page layout, but it also works as a sign of a battle with many losses to come. On top of the drawn newspaper, Bechdel has placed a caption that reads, "The tidal wave of AIDS hadn't hit yet." Another caption in the same panel reads, "For all we knew, it was really morning in America," which is likely another reference to Reagan, referring to his 1984 campaign ad, "Morning in America." Reading the caption out aloud, we might hear what is foreshadowed on the page, morning, as in MOURNING, morning in America, a structure of feeling also gestured to by the partially visible drawing of an angel in Allison's sketchbook. The final panel on the page shows our cartoonist back in the archive, telling us that as the months wore on, I started to wake up, and returning the bong of the middle panel to a file drawer labeled 1981, as if to say, after 1981, getting high was no longer the antidote for feeling bewildered. Let me keep moving. Okay. Oops, I'm having trouble. There we go. Bechdel starts to wake up in relation to the lesbian and proto-queer politics of the 1980s, and through her desire to find a form to capture this unruly pageant, the sheer plenitude of it all. She discovers there is plenty of revolutionary ferment still afoot, and that she wants to be part of this insurrection. Her awakening is as much political as it is formal. Bechdel depicts a head-spinning Allison, both as she takes in the pageant and plenitude of lesbian politics and culture, and on the next page, as she realizes the possibility that emerges out of her decision to start drawing women in their many shapes and forms, masculine, feminine, and everything in between, which would become the characters for her long-running cartoon Dykes to Watch Out For, that would be syndicated in alternative newspapers. Bechdel's portrait of a twisting, double-headed avatar of herself also suggests the formal doubling and torquing that comes out of her recognition that she wasn't a writer or an artist, but a writer and an artist. This is a key image for Bechdel's queer vision and form, combining word and image, past and present, feminine and masculine, art and politics. Allison's eyes on the head on the left look tired, even closed. She could be asleep. Whereas her eyes on the right are popped open and huge. This key image literalizes her awakening. The twisting, and I'm going to shift to sexile now. And so this section is called Trans Everything. The twisting, double-headed Allison breaks the fourth wall of the panel to make eye contact with and speak to the reader. What if I stopped drawing guys and started drawing dykes? Next to Allison's torquing head is a caption that reads, "Dull World Health Organization pamphlets," with an arrow pointing to a stack of pamphlets on the shelf behind Allison. In a single panel, Bechdel verbally and visually connects her awakening about the political and aesthetic transformation of her art with the possibility of creating new modes of communication about health activism. A similar motivation and sense of transformative possibility is at work in the creation of the HIV prevention publication Sexile. Written, drawn, and lettered by Mexican-American artist and cultural worker Jaime Cortez, Sexile is, like Bechdel's work, far from a dull World Health Organization pamphlet. Cortez came up with the project after he conducted multiple interviews with transgender AIDS activist Adela Vasquez. He opens his introduction with a vivid image of Adela. The life of Adela Vasquez is trans everything, transnational, transgendered, transformative, and fully transfixing. By presenting Adela's trans everything life in a digital comic, Cortez shows that comics as a medium are transformative and fully transfixing too. I want to turn that, okay. In his foreword, editor Patrick Pato Hebert anticipates a question from readers about form, asking why a comic book when so many pressing issues about AIDS are worthy of our resources. Answering his own question and linking art, politics, and wellness, Hebert asserts, in order to reinvigorate prevention, we must continue to innovate our concepts and modalities. AIDS service agencies can learn much by listening to Adela and the very communities that prevention efforts seek to assist. With more people living with HIV than ever before and communities of color disproportionately affected, we need nothing less than holistic, dynamic approaches to wellness. Comics is a medium, then, that has the potential to convey knowledge not only about HIV transmission and safer sex, but also about the interconnected histories of LGBTQ activism and illness politics and practices of care that have emerged out of communities of color in the US and beyond. In its presentation of public health information, Sexile's holistic, dynamic approach is formally more evocative and less pragmatic than Making It. If Making It uses comics to illustrate information and generate a sense of community through the presentation of practices of safer sex and the use of humor, Sexile offers Adela's story as an exemplary yet relatable personal story framed by a context that is both geographically broad and historically deep. Here I'm drawing on Paul Farmer's anthropological public health method of telling exemplary stories as a means to understand how structural violence operates to constrain people's choices in relation to maintaining health and well-being, as well as how individuals and communities nonetheless find ways to resist structural violence in their everyday lives. Vasquez's personal story is nested within what Hebert calls compelling meta-histories, two that were front page news as the United States stumbled into the 1980s, and a third that unfolded with much less visibility. The two front page news stories are both arrival stories. The first, the arrival of approximately 130,000 Cuban refugees to the US as part of the Mariel boat lift in 1980, and the second, the arrival of AIDS around the same time, which, as we know from Bechdel's Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, was not a front page story immediately. The third, less prominent but still significant meta-history Hebert identifies is transgender organizing and theorizing that was also emerging in the early 1980s. These meta-histories create a conjuncture in which illness politics, racial politics, and sexual politics are all intertwined. And your series of talks is called Conjunctures. The conjuncture is used several times in this paper and is really kind of a way that I'm thinking about this moment. So there's a conjuncture here. Not unlike Bechdel's story of her arrival in New York City along with the AIDS virus, Adela's personal story becomes a kind of portal into this meta-historical conjuncture. And the term sexile linguistically suggests both an emergent identity category and a social and cultural disposition born out of displacement. Cortez literalizes the concept in his drawing of the word sexile in and as the water under the boat that transports Adela to the US from Cuba. This image is captioned with Adela's words, "On May 13th, 1980, I left Cuba forever." While Sexile shows how Adela's escape from Cuba made possible her becoming woman and indeed becoming Adela, nevertheless, the passage is marked by loss too. Yet as with Making It and Dykes to Watch Out For, the tone of Sexile is not portentous, but is often self-deprecating and campy. Not to brag, but my birth was revolutionary. This statement from Adela opens Sexile, and the full-page black and white image that accompanies it is a redrawing of a newsreel still of the victorious Cuban revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, arriving in Havana, cheered on by onlookers. Adela explains that she was born in November 1958, at the same time that the rebels were making their way across Cuba, kicking ass from east to west. Like Bechdel, then, Cortez reproduces other media in order to capture the complexity of the historico-political moment into which Adela is born. Despite the feelings of hope that bloomed for many in Cuba during Adela's and the revolutionary government's early years, we soon learn from her about some of the ways the spirit of the times was in fact not so revolutionary, at least when it came to sexual politics. The political contradictions are contained in a single page depicting a young Adela in Cuba and an older Adela recalling her life in Cuba in her interview with Cortez. We see a 15-year-old Adela getting a hit of girl power by performing in the school drag pageant. At the top of the page are 3 elongated rectangular panels which present different views of Adela's performance. In the panel on the left, we see her headless body from behind with the pageant audience framed between her strong, curvy legs, which dominate the panel. The top middle panel shows Adela at the center of the stage, flanked by 2 other drag performers in the background. She is lit up by a spotlight and strides forward confidently and fabulously. In the top right panel, we are now amongst the audience looking up at her as she stands at the edge of the stage, exuding sensuality and exuberantly holding her head high and mighty. Below these panels, Cortez has drawn Adela in the present with an outline of Cuba behind her as she explains, "Cuba is complicated, you know? Dressing as a woman was illegal, and there I was doing it for a school event." Sorrow shows on her face as Adela recalls the missed opportunity for Cuba and the predicament for people like her at that time. "It should have been heaven, but Cuba had no place for my revolution. Only rules and closets and traps for the freaks. I met queens who were captured in the 60s and forced into labor camps to get fixed." Adela is lucky to escape this ideological cure, and after a harrowing transit to the US on her own, lucky again to be sponsored by Rolando Victoria, who she describes as the most bitchy, hilarious, faggoty faggot ever, who helps her settle into a new life in America. Adela is also lucky that Rolando is a nurse. When she explains to him that she has had to go to the clinic to get treated for gonorrhea, Rolando tells her, "From now on, chicklet, you use a condom every time you're gonna fuck." So here's this image. That's Rolando at the top. Adela is dismissive of this advice, but Rolando describes what he has seen at the hospital where he works. Queens, young queens, they're coming into the hospital sick. They get crazy exotic cancers and infections, and then they die. Cortez renders the last 4 words, "and then they die," in smaller lettering, as if Rolando whispers them, seemingly still in shock at and not quite believing what he has seen. In the background of the middle panel at the center of the page, Cortez has drawn a ghost-like man dying in a hospital bed, creating a holy trinity with Rolando's talking head on either side of the ghostly image, as Rolando describes the horrible, painful deaths he has witnessed. This, then, is how AIDS first appears in the text, through the witnessing of a queer Cuban nurse of people dying, as well as advice on how to survive. In the next panel, Rolando explains to Adela that he thinks the disease is transmitted sexually. When Adela tries to make a joke about wanting to get pregnant and start a family, Rolando becomes very angry, yelling that this is not a joke and insisting that Adela always use condoms. This page provides a glimpse into the early years of the AIDS epidemic in the US, showing both the terrifying emergence of the disease in the LGBTQ community, as well as how members of the community took care of their own and advocated for practices of safer sex from the start. Rolando doesn't tell Adela not to have sex. Rather, he provides her with information about how to have sex safely. It is this advice that helps her survive the AIDS crisis and also inspires her to become an AIDS activist. Many in the LGBT community do not survive this period, of course, including Rolando. His death is communicated via a completely Black page with only a single hand-lettered sentence. Rolando eventually drank himself to death. The burnout from caring for so many sick and dying and the trauma of witnessing to the AIDS crisis became too much to bear for Rolando and many other queer healthcare workers. Okay, and now I'm going to shift to the last section called Drawing Comics as Care, Taking Turns, and this is a little bit shorter, so I'm getting towards the end. I want to conclude with a brief discussion of another story of a queer nurse caring for people with AIDS, M.K. Serwick's Taking Turns. Serwick's graphic narrative recounts the philosophy and practices of a clinical unit dedicated to the care of people with AIDS in Chicago during the early 1990s. Serwick explains that Unit 371 looked and felt different from other units. The walls were covered with Broadway show posters and art made by patients in the art therapy room. There was a kitchen that was always open with healthy and delicious food available for patients and staff. And there was a sense of camaraderie between patients and staff. Oops, I'm gonna go this way. Oh, there we go. The ethos of the unit came from its founders, Drs. David Blatt and David Moore, who were gay and saw the clinic as an opportunity to take care of our own people. Patient advocacy was an important aspect of their practices of doctoring, as well as a radical empathy that the AIDS crisis generated among many in the LGBTQ community, a response we see in all the texts I have analyzed in this presentation. Serwick's title expresses this ethos of care on the unit. We are just people taking turns being sick, as Dr. Blatt says. The art therapy program and art room created a space described as the heart of the unit that helps patients and practitioners on the unit to create an alternative emotional vocabulary. Yet the image I want to end this talk with was not one made in the art room, but after the unit closes, and it functions as a passageway in the text and real life. Serwick chronicles the arrival of the protease inhibitors and the excitement and relief of finally having a treatment for HIV/AIDS that transformed it from a death sentence to a chronic condition for those who had access to the new drug therapies. As a result of these successful treatments, the AIDS unit would close in 1999, which, as Serwick notes, was a cause for celebration, but also left her feeling miserable and ashamed for feeling miserable. Echoing Bechdel's aesthetic and political revelation in Dykes to Watch Out For, Serwick explains that in this moment, neither painting or writing felt adequate to the task of documenting the complexity of her feelings about what she had lived through, both the trauma of AIDS and the incredible caring response from so many in the gay community. At the end of the penultimate chapter of Taking Turns, just after the AIDS unit has closed and as the millennium turns, Serwick shows how she had to let a new way find her for documenting her experiences on the AIDS unit. In a series of 4 panels across the page, Serwick draws herself drawing her first comic. In the first panel, we see Serwick from behind, sitting in front of a blank white piece of paper. In the sequence, once she has drawn herself on the page, the crude representation stands in for the artist in the rest of the panels. Below each panel is a thought balloon, and in these words, the concept of a comic takes shape in a series of steps. Number 1, maybe I'll just draw myself. Number 2, I'll put a box around it. Number 3, another box, and it's a comic, like Linda Berry. The final panel shows a completed comic, and under it is Serwick's realization that the comic contains both sadness and hope. This comic within a comic depicts the emergence of the comic we are reading. Serwick's becoming comic nurse, this is what she kind of goes by now, and graphic medicine as a formal way out. Both word and image, both sadness and hope, both nurse and artist, both and, doubled and torqued as a practice of care of the self and others. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. This was brilliant. Thank you so much.
I'll
It was
stop
excellent. I've already got 3 or 4 questions. If you don't mind, I'll just read them up, and you should feel free to comment on them. Okay, the first question here is from Bianca. Good afternoon, Professor Diedrich. Thank you so much for the excellent lecture. Could you talk a little bit more about AIDS, the embodied experience of illness, and a possible state violence through health politics, please? Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Bianca. That's a huge question. And I think, let me just clarify, you're kind of wanting to think about both the kind of embodied phenomenological experience of illness and then the kind of structural or structural violence of the state that might sort of impact that experience. Is that sort of what the question is?
Yes.
Well, I think we can see that in there's lots of examples in what people are dealing with right now with COVID-19 in terms of how certain groups are impacted more by illnesses. And so we talk about things like the distribution of risk, right? And the distribution of risk is not equal. So a lot of people at the beginning of COVID-19 kind of wanted to say, because of the way it's transmitted, that everybody is at risk of COVID-19, but in fact, not everybody is equally at risk. So we know that people are more at risk, more vulnerable because of their particular situation for illness. And so we want to kind of think about structures that impact either negatively or positively people's health. And I think this is really important to kind of think about. In relation to some of what I presented today, I think one of the things that you can kind of take from that is that communities responded. So in the US, the LGBTQ community was the first community to really respond as a community to AIDS. Even as there was silence. So the references to Reagan, President Reagan, who sort of famously did not say the words AIDS until well into the epidemic. He would refuse to say the words. And so the gay community and activist groups like ACT UP basically were fighting what they called, government denial and negligence, and were basically saying that the state is at fault for so many deaths in the gay community. So we see this in terms of how groups respond to illness in their communities, and I think we're seeing this in relation to COVID-19, and I hope we see kind of more of this, making these connections between the state and health of individuals and groups. So thank you for that question.
Oh, thank you. Lisa, there is another question here. You mentioned the burnout from caring for so many sick and dying and the trauma of witnessing to the AIDS crisis. So how do you think an LGBTQ plus ethics of care should handle the challenge of triage and utilitarian choices in critical times like the global COVID pandemic we're facing today?
Yeah, that's also a great, well, first of all, I do think, and I know we have some healthcare workers on the call, so I don't want to speak for them, but I do think we are seeing burnout, and we have seen burnout, and it's also related not just to the relentlessness of the pandemic, but also to the fact that there's a sense that government actions have hurt or not helped. And so there's a feeling of being left to face this on their own without support. So I think we really want to kind of think about that in relation to, again, in relation to the first question about state violence. It seems to me the fact that so many healthcare workers haven't had what they need to protect themselves. And then also the kind of issues related to speaking out or being prevented from speaking out, healthcare workers being prevented from speaking out, I think is also very important. And we see some echoes of that with HIV/AIDS. In relation to kind of LGBTQ ethics of care and how to handle kind of utilitarian choices. I mean, I get a little anxious about utilitarianism in terms of, and this is mostly because of thinking about disability in particular, and thinking about decisions about lives worth living or not. I think we have to really think about some problems of those kinds of decisions in terms of whose life is worth more and so should be protected. So I think we really need to hear from disability activists about some of these issues related to the kind of choices in critical times, because I think also I worry about the idea of choices in critical times, because I think, in fact, we have the resources. We just, in many respects, don't deem them worth utilizing on particular problems. So that again also goes back to the first question about what the state sees as a problem or not. And this is what we saw in the US in terms of the response to AIDS, was a lack of response. And so, groups like ACT UP basically said the government has blood on its hands because people have died because of inaction. And I think we're seeing that now too. So what are our resources really in terms of addressing these kinds of issues? I think we have far more. I never quite, and this is where I also like somebody like Paul Farmer. He's always saying we can treat, when people say things like, we don't have the resources to treat people for AIDS in Africa. He's like, we have the resources to treat people for AIDS in Africa. So it's that the kind of question, the framing of the question gets constrained already. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to address, first of all. That's an ethical issue, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. Julia has a question. Please go ahead.
I believe there are other questions before. I believe Kara had a question.
That's okay. It's your turn.
Go ahead, Julia, and then we'll get to, I see Kara.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Kara.
Oh, sorry.
Should I go?
Go ahead. Yeah. And then I'll get
Okay.
Kara's question.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It's so interesting. And my question was, because it seems it's very interesting as a healthcare worker, when in the comics she said the boring panels from like the World Health Organization. Yeah. And my project in my residency is actually making a pamphlet for women's sexual health. But what I was thinking was in Paulo Freire's thinking of making educational pamphlets or information for the population, with the population, and thinking what kind of graphic production and novels exist in that kind of thinking. Like, of course, it's already very important and very different to have some someone from the community making a graphic novel or writing, but is there a work with a group of people or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's great. And I agree with you. And there is some work, and maybe I'll share it with you, but of where kind of collaborative projects, working with communities to develop their own. And of course, I think, you know, I didn't emphasize this a lot, but Sexile, you know, starts with these sort of conversations with Adela, and then they decide to kind of, and I believe there are sort of recordings of those interviews, I think there's some writings about written interviews with Adela Vasquez. But then the decision to kind of create a comic is about kind of distributing and making it sort of more accessible. It's again a kind of accessibility issue, making it more accessible to people and communities. But no, this idea of kind of a project emerging out of the community itself, I think is a kind of interest of people who are kind of graphic medicine practitioners. Like, how can we find out what communities need themselves, how they understand what the issues are in their communities. And that I think that practice that's a methodological question as well, like how are you going to access that information from the community? And then also, how can you kind of create a form that allows it to be conveyed? So yeah, that's a really, I think, important aspect of graphic medicine as a kind of movement, I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, then we have Kara, and there is another written question. Please, Kara, go ahead.
Are you there, Kara?
Yes.
Hey.
Hi there.
There you are. Okay, I see you. Hey.
Yes, I had typed in the chat and I wanted to talk more about the graphic medicine as well, as I am working on some comics myself and also received the feedback, like they're formal and that's how they work in some sense. But I think I'm wondering, from your perspective of reading and criticism, do you see that more in terms of form and poetry, or formality in terms of like the high-low debate with comics? Because I'm a little confused by that. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'm talking about form, the comics form, but I'm also kind of, I want to play with the idea of how important form is to not formality necessarily. Now, I'm not talking about formality. I'm glad you're clarifying that, but how important form is to politics, actually. So the kind of question of how we do politics seems very important to me. So how we communicate information is a kind of political act. And so thinking about the form, so I'm partly influenced by, groups like ACT UP that used visual, I don't know why I did that to show visual, but that used posters and stuff, right, in very interesting ways to communicate about AIDS. And so I see graphic medicine as kind of doing that, participating in that as well. So not about the kind of high-low, although comics, of course, typically gets talked about as a low cultural form, right? So I think that's important. That relates to Julia's question about how we might use comics, ways that comics might become more accessible than other sort of forms for communicating. So the dull World Health Organization pamphlet, right, that's trying to communicate public health information. But yeah, so form matters. Form helps us to see things and understand things, I think, and it's really sort of important. And in my work and how I approach things, really comics have helped me think about how I approach things, because this kind of both and of the verbal and the visual has been really helpful for me to think through how communication works, right? How we can effectively or communicate information about health and illness. So yeah, thank you for that question and helping clarify that. Appreciate it.
Thank you. There is another question here from Ajamir. Do you want me to read it, Ajamir? All right. The art therapy program and art room created a space described as the heart of the unit that helps patients and practitioners on the unit to create an alternative emotional vocabulary. Yeah. Could you explain more about this art therapy program?
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't have any images of that in the presentation, but the unit basically had this very prominent, had a whole room devoted to art therapy. Well, the art room, which basically was a place for both, not just patients, but also the practitioners to do art. And this, and Sarah Wick sort of shows this in her book, that how important that was in terms of helping kind of create a means to kind of talk about their experiences of illness, and also for the practitioners, their experience of burnout and also loss. I mean, because they're seeing and witnessing so much death. So some of what they did, and she's got images of the drawings of this in the book. They did life masks, so creating masks of the patients that would then be able to be given to someone as a kind of literally a memento mori, a kind of death memento. And she discusses, you know, how that was done and how what people, you know, whether people just sort of created a very simple mask or decorated it and created something sort of more elaborate and personal and you know, kind of revealing of something of the self. But I think the interesting thing and the interesting thing about the unit that Sir Wick talks about is it's kind of it's recognizing the real relationships, the kind of how boundaries get broken down between patient and health practitioners. So she discusses how people, you know, the importance of touching, actually. And so we know that in many healthcare spaces, the idea of sort of intimate touching is, of course, you know, not particularly, people are told not to do that, right? Even though there's a lot of intimate touching in doctoring, you know, there's this kind of importance of the boundaries, right? Maintaining boundaries between doctor and patient. And she says that on this unit, there was a recognition that partly because of the stigma of AIDS and partly because some patients had experienced extreme stigma and rejection by their families, that it was important for caregivers to actually, you know, do things like get in the bed with the patient. Something we would say is a no-no, but get into bed to like read with the patient. And also the importance of hugging. And so that kind of breakdown, the art practice sort of helped in terms of the breakdown of those boundaries between, and also, you know, some patients were sort of less verbally communicative about what they were experiencing. And this is, I think, one of the sort of ideas of art therapy, right? That a person can sometimes better communicate by doing art than by saying what they're feeling. So yeah, this is a key component of the unit that Sir Wick describes. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Okay, there's another question here in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Diedrich. In your talk, you mentioned Cortes' comment on the word sexile as being full of longing, awareness, invention, and displacement. Do you agree with the idea of overcoming shame and guilt emotions usually associated with the experience of many transgender individuals related to their gender identity, often in connection with their personal situations, such as domestic abuse, trauma, illness, and sexual orientation?
Yeah, another really great question. First of all, I mean, I actually don't do justice to any of these works at all. So Sexile is available online, and I hope you will check it out, because I don't really show in the paper, because I kind of want to focus on HIV prevention work, and I also want to focus on the arrival of HIV and the kind of teaching about HIV from Rolando to Adela. That I don't show you or talk, didn't show you or talk about Adela's, and I use Adela because Adela, you saw some images, right, that show Adela before transformation in terms of looking physically more masculine than feminine, but her gender identity, and her gender identity is kind of interesting in transgender, rather than there's a kind of process of becoming a woman that she shows in the comic, but there's also a kind of a process that I sort of refer to, but I don't really develop much, of her becoming Adela, something sort of in between. And this is important and kind of shown visually in the text, as well as kind of narrativized in her story. But definitely, you know, she escapes, and I sort of call her lucky because she kind of makes a lucky escape, getting on the boat on her own. But it's partly because her family worries that something terrible will happen to her if she stays. And some things did happen to her, some violence and was done to her, and that is shown in the book or in the comic. And so the text does kind of show that how, I would say, more shame and stigma operate in terms of trans identity, but it also shows how, I mean, Adela is this kind of amazing figure who's just, and I hate this word now, but resilient, who really kind of survives and is able, because she survives, is able to kind of become herself, and in a kind of fabulous way. So I think that there's, you know, a lot about her figuring out in the context of Cuba, and a kind of very homophobic and transphobic environment, figuring out that she's sort of different from people and trying to kind of express herself, and being sort of limited in her ability to do that. And that is shown in the comic, but it also shows the importance of sort of, you know, in an almost cliche way, being true to oneself. And she sort of reveals that, and it's kind of, and that's this kind of medium of the sexile, the escape, that is freedom, but is also loss, because you leave behind your life in Cuba. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There is here a practical question, which is not theoretical at all.
Okay.
Professor Diedrich, are you making your PowerPoint slides available in PDF?
I can certainly do that. Yes. I realize I didn't share them with you guys in advance, but I certainly can. I'll send them to you. Yeah. Happy to do that. And yeah, I really recommend also just looking up, especially Sexile is easy to find. Maybe I can I'll send you a PDF of it as well, and then you can share it with everyone. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
very kind of
Happy to
you.
do that.
Yes. Hi, guys. We still have enough time for another or a couple of short questions. Anyone?
People are saying, oh my gosh, okay. Yeah, there's somebody has shared, right? Who is Nita? Did you share Sexile?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
Sexile is in the chat, folks. Sorry,
Right.
I'm slowly
Yes.
reading the chat. Yeah.
Well, there is one background question. I was wondering, what would you make of these, let's say, more recent developments in real conquest in terms of public opinion in most democracies? Let's think especially of what we call Western democracies, because as we know, Russia, for instance, or China, and many countries which are still very much hostile towards LGBTQI identities. What would you make in terms of these, let's say, 40 or 50 years since the first situations we had, especially in your account, both in your book, in your talk presentation today, of the LGBTQ movement around the planet? Of course, this seems like a very long question, but in your own American experience, how would you see these, the way these normative claims have made a real impact in US society?
Yeah. I think, I think there's amazing changes have been made. And I do think that in some respects we have come very far, but in some respects also what we perhaps focus on is not how I would approach it. So I think things like marriage equality, as important as that is symbolically, and I'm firmly in favor of marriage equality, but I think also that as a good feminist, I have a critique of marriage, and I don't think in some ways that gets us as far as we need to go. And so I think there's a way that some of the LGBTQ movement, especially in the US, is a kind of interested in a kind of respectability politics. And I worry about that a little bit. I think that's not I think we need to have a politics that's much more critical. And I think in some ways that's, so that there's a space for that kind of respectability politics that fits a certain normative frame. And I think that takes away from some of what the possibility of a kind of gay liberation movement that we saw earlier. So I would have some critiques about that. But I also think we're in really illiberal, and I think this word is really interesting because I do stuff on illness, and I'm really interested in how illness is central to a lot of sort of social theory. And we're in this sort of illiberal moment where, gender studies and LGBTQ studies are being targeted. And so that kind of question of making these kinds of spaces, which you're doing here with your work here in Brazil or there in Brazil, you're creating kind of spaces that I think are really, really important. And we need to sort of do that and kind of think about our practices in terms of making these connections. So I think, even though I think the LGBT movement in the US has been pretty neoliberal, basically, I also think the fact that they're using sort of trans, right, politics as a sort of the right is focusing on anti-trans politics in this country right now shows how these sorts of transformations are, they do reveal something about significant social changes that's perceived by the right. And so we are in a moment of possibility. It was also a very scary moment, I think. And yes, I think people, trans people especially, are quite vulnerable, and that's very worrisome. I think that they are actually targets of the right is worrisome. Yeah. So a moment of possibility, but also a very scary, yes, an illiberal moment. That's right. I think so. Yes, we are in a Brazilian space. Yes, we are in a Brazilian space. Yes, exactly, Pam.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Diedrich. Once again, if someone else would like to raise a question, make a comment, please. Pam, anyone? Camila?
Here's one from Odalis. Hi, Odalis.
All right.
I know some folks already on here, but I'm happy to meet new folks too. What are your thoughts on this aftermath and return to normal rhetoric following events of the past and present? Yeah, I don't think you guys, well, maybe you are experiencing this in Brazil, but right, this is incredible, right, Odalis, that this idea that we're returning to normal, but yet the cases worldwide are at a high. So it's sort of, first of all, there's a problem with the kind of very limited focus of the US, and to suggest that everything's okay in the US, which of course it isn't, but to suggest that things are going well with the vaccine rollout in the US, that somehow things are good and back to normal. I think that's really wrong, and also just sort of shows some of the problems with how we understand public health, and also community, and how we understand care, and our sort of relationships with other people, thinking more broadly than our sort of immediate relationships. So I think this is, yeah, and you're saying, given the unequal distribution of the trauma and loss, yeah, collective and individual, and even of course in this country, right, in the US, we're seeing that the unequal distribution of trauma and loss is so significant. And I also think, and this is the case in the US, Brazil, also the number of people who have died, and I think it's incredible, and there's no way people have dealt with those immense losses. There's no way. I mean, that's something we can kind of connect with AIDS and the kind of continuing effects and impact of AIDS, even to this day, right, on people. The trauma of so much loss in such a short period of time is kind of incredible. So yeah. Pam's asking, how are trans folks surviving Bolsonaro? Yeah, so Nita, maybe you can answer this, in COVID in Brazil. I was last in Brazil right before the election, and people were very scared.
Yes, Pam, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's been very, very difficult for gay, queer, trans, LGBTQ people in general in Brazil since Bolsonaro took office 2 years ago. In our one of our upcoming presentations will be precisely on this Lesbocide, as they called it in Rio de Janeiro. Maria Clara is leading a collective, and it's a research group on lesbians and trans in Rio who have been targeted, just like Lisa mentioned, at this particular difficult moment of Brazilian politics. And they're going to be talking about this. They have numbers, figures, and everything. But overall, Lisa, not only for LGBTQ people in general, but also for feminicide, aggressions and violation of women's rights,
Yes.
we know that everything has increased in the past 2 years in Brazil.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is, I do think the target of on women, and this is kind of also connects with gender studies programs, this kind of demonizing of gender studies. Well, and that's a good thing, because it is actually suggesting that there's a reason to be, that the right is worried about things that we're doing in gender and LGBTQ studies. Yeah, we want to change things for sure. So they're right to be worried about that. But it doesn't make it, I mean, it is scary in terms of the target, because thinking in terms of resources and the resources that people have, that's what's worrisome, I think. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. And wow, I'm just looking at them all. Thank you. Great.
Yes, yes, I think we are running out of time here. Once again, let's express our gratitude to Professor Lisa Diedrich for this beautiful presentation, this very instigating, interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Lisa. And let's continue with our collaboration and interaction. We are very glad to have you here together with our graduate students and folks from US, Canada, and all over. And this talk is going to be posted on YouTube in case anyone wants to send the link to someone else. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Bye.
Bye.
All right.